Welcome back. On to part 2. The trade and eventual collapse of Mongol rule will push Europeans toward Africa.
Thus, we have the quest for African gold. Now, we have trading colonies in Tunis, which were established to facilitate trade from North Africa. The goods traded for African grain and gold. The medieval demand for gold accelerated during the 14th century and could not be met. Silver production in Eastern Europe has declined. Gold becomes the alternative currency for Europe. Africa, well, especially Mali and Ghana, called the land of gold by Muslim geographers. Now we have Mansa Musa, who is the Sultan of the region, considered the richest man in the world. And the domain was also prized for salt and ivory.
European commerce in African gold was not new. It had occurred for centuries, facilitated by Muslim traders whose caravans brought a steady supply from the Niger River to North African ports in Algiers and Tunis. Here we have a depiction of Mansa Musa. Specifically, Musa I was of the wealthy West African Empire of Mali. His title, Mansa, means effectively both Sultan and Emperor, capturing the breadth of his power as a conqueror, king, and religious leader. He is depicted prominently in an important cartographic manuscript known as the Catalan Atlas, created in 1375 and attributed to Presque Abraham, a Jewish artist and master of maps, who strove to capture the contours of the entire world, in keeping with Mansa Musa's reputation as the richest man on earth, at least at that time, and really maybe for all time. He wears a crown of real gold leaf and is holding a gold coin. He's also shown enthroned and holding a scepter, just the same as a European monarch would be. How does this image and the making of this atlas reflect the developments we are studying throughout this chapter?
The Mediterranean underwent several models of colonization. The pattern of Catalan colonial expansion, which included the expulsion or the extermination of the existing population. We have the extension of economic concessions to attract new settlers, and the reliance on slave labor to produce foodstuffs and raw materials for export. We have Venice in the eastern Mediterranean. Their colonies were administered directly by city rulers or by appointed colonial governors, and their colonies in Greece, Cyprus, and the Dalmatian coast. And we have Genoa in the western Mediterranean, with trading colonies of family networks that were closely integrated with the peoples among whom they lived.
This heightened interest in African gold coincided with the merchants' creation of entrepreneurial empires in the Western Mediterranean. During the 13th century, Catalan adventurers would conquer and colonize a series of Western Mediterranean islands. These would include Majorca, Ibiza, Minorca, Sardinia, and Sicily. Here is the church at Valsey in Greenland, located on the southern tip of Greenland. Valsey was originally a farmstead established in the late 10th century by the uncle of Eric the Red, the father of the explorer Leif Erikson. The church at Valsey, pictured here, was built in the 12th century and roofed with turf. It was the site of the last documented event in the history of the North settlement on the island, a wedding which took place in 1408. By that time, the population had largely died out due to starvation and disease.
Indeed, we will see a push from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Now, we have the Canaries and the Azores Islands. Now, Genoese sailors reached this in the 14th century, and efforts to colonize the Canary Islands and to convert and enslave their inhabitants. Well, this becomes a focus of a new wave of colonial settlement sponsored by the Portuguese. Now, in the northern Atlantic, we have the Viking Leif Erikson and his settlement in Vinland, which was not permanent. We have Viking Greenland, which had farming, fishing, hunting, and foraging. And the agrarian economy fails with the gradual cooling of the climate in the 14th century.
For centuries, European maritime commerce had been divided into two blocks, the Mediterranean world and the northeastern Atlantic world. Around 1270, Italian merchants began to sail through the Straits of Gibraltar into England directly. Europeans started to discover, or at least rediscover, the islands across the Atlantic. In the south, these islands were known as the Azores and the Canaries. In the north, Iceland and Greenland. Medieval travel will leave the Mediterranean in favor of the Atlantic. Europeans began working their way further down the coast of northwest Africa, past the Straits of Gibraltar and south. We have, of course, the Canary Islands. The native inhabitants, the Guanches, already had interactions with Berber groups as early as the 1st century CE, but they had not faced full colonization. Lanzarote would be taken by the French in 1402, and of course the Spanish will take the remainder. But why? The answer, of course, is trade. In a sense, you might even call it an economic boom in Europe.
Now we have the economic boom, which led to the refinement of business models and accounting techniques. There were new forms of partnership, development of insurance contracts, and minimized risk. Double entry bookkeeping. It's a clearer picture of their profits and losses. We have branch banking. The Florentine Medicis were in almost all of the major cities. And we have advanced credit techniques.
The success of Europeans in the New World led to an explosion of new wealth. Eyeglasses will be invented in the 1280s, aiding in reading, writing, accounting. Maritime tools such as the magnetic compass and navigation charts, including the Portolani or Portolan charts. But also, their design is now to show the location of ports, prevailing winds, reefs, and other known perils, as opposed to just give a general idea of where something is in relationship to something else. We have the development of mechanical clocks, which further stimulated interest in complex machinery of all sorts, but they would also regulate daily life. Surprise, surprise, dividing the day into exact units as opposed to roughly half-hour blocks, which humans do naturally. These are, of course, going to change work hours and equate time at work to money, though you still have full day and half day pay, what is often called winter wages. That system will linger still for a few hundred years.
Now, eyeglasses were invented in the 1280s and perfected in the 14th century. Magnetic compass would help ships sail farther from land, and the Portolani maps, well, they noted ports, prevailing winds, routes, and known perils. Farms only needed the sun to operate. And, of course, villages worth the needed work that other people might need needed a finer gradation of time, and so we needed clocks. The initials, of course, were the sundial, which has been used since 2000 BC. However, those weren't all that great, obviously, because of the sun. The water clock was much better and was used in towns as a village or a town clock device. but we needed something like a mechanical method. And so we have the invention of the Virgin Foliot escapement, which was great, except it would lose or gain an hour to 2 hours per day, which unfortunately was not increased until the Virgin Pendulum method in the 17th century and the anchor escapement, which was a few years later, which is beyond what we are talking about. Done.
Ausgezeichnet. Very good.
Now we see here a scholar wearing eyeglasses. Now, this fresco on the wall of a church in Treviso, which is in northern Italy, was painted between 1351 and 1352. It shows a theologian at his desk working on a manuscript with the aid of his newfangled spectacles.
And boy, do they look uncomfortable. Those loops around the ears look like they really chafe. But I digress. Here we have a portolan chart. Accurate mapping would be essential to the success of maritime and colonial ventures in the 13th and 14th centuries. The chart shown here is the oldest surviving example of a map used by mariners to navigate between Mediterranean ports. The word portolan is a term for such charts. It dates from the end of the 13th century, and its shape clearly indicates that it was just made from an animal hide. So you may understand that these aren't necessarily the highest quality of products, valued more for their information than necessarily the delivery of it. Although parchment is extremely durable, it would slowly wear down due to prolonged exposure to salt water as well as other elements, hence the rarity of this early example.
Now we have the English Franciscan William of Ockham, who died approximately 1348. Now, he denied that human reason could prove fundamental theological truths, such as the existence of God. He argued that human knowledge of God depended entirely on what God revealed through Scripture. He urged humans to investigate the natural world and better understand its laws, without positing any connection between the observable properties of nature and the unknowable essence of divinity. Now we also have nominalism, which is the distinction between the rational comprehensibility of the real world and the spiritual incomprehensibility of God. Nominalism encourages empirical observation and posits that knowledge of the world should rest on sensory experience rather than abstract theories.
Thomas Aquinas had constructed a theological view of the world as rational, organized, and comprehensible to the inquiring human mind, but confidence in this synthesis would wane throughout the 14th century. So here we have Giotto's entry into Jerusalem. This is a fresco by Giotto di Bondone of Florence, and it exemplifies this new artistic attention to the realistic portrayal of the natural world and human relationship. Here, Giotto depicts Christ's arrival in Jerusalem surrounded by his disciples. Yet, what draws the eye are the excited boys climbing the nearby trees and the thronging crowd of townspeople rushing to spread their garments on the ground. What human characteristics and emotions does this painting convey to the viewer? How is this different from earlier, more medieval art that we have seen in this course?
Now we will see that art became more realistic. The Italian artists started creating freestanding pictures on pieces of wood or canvas using tempera. Art became portable and commercial, and of course, more freedom to choose subject matter. We could build an individual brand. Now, Giotto da Bondone of Florence between 1267 and 1337. He painted both walls in fresco and he painted portable wooden panels. His depictions were lifelike. The subjects were doing natural things and was considered the painter who inspired the Italian Renaissance.
Fascination with the natural world also informed the artists of this era. They paid close attention to the way plants, animals, and human beings really look. You'll see this especially when we get to Leonardo da Vinci.
Now, Dante Alighieri's great work is The Divine Comedy. The comedy describes the poet's imaginary journey through hell, purgatory, and paradiso, or the paradise. The narrator is led through the first two realms, hell and purgatory, by the poet Virgil, who represents the best of classical culture. Dante is then guided toward knowledge of the divine in paradise by his deceased beloved Beatrice, who symbolizes Christian wisdom. The monumental poem is a fusion of Latin learning and vernacular artistry, and a response to the political turmoil that engulfed Italy.
Let's hear it for the Italian vernacular. The exact contemporary of Giotto, that is to say, Dante Alighieri of Florence, pioneered what he called the sweet new style of poetry, i.e., the Italian vernacular. But he depicted popes who had held high offices in the church, as well as foreign rulers who sought to subjugate Italy, and the rapacious Italian princes who fought among themselves, all in hell in rather unflattering positions. It's also thanks to Dante that we have our very much modern conception of hell and its many layers.
Now, this brings us to the limitations of papal power. Now, papal power extends further into the secular realm that compromises spiritual credibility. The Pope meddles in Sicily against the German Emperor Frederick II. The Pope calls for a crusade led by Charles of Anjou, who was crowned King of Sicily, and Charles' subjects offered their allegiance to the King of Aragon.
Power of the papacy reached a new height in the 13th century, but as popes attempted to extend the influence into the secular sphere, political struggles will ensue. A key overreach by the pope involved the younger brother of the King of France, Charles of Anjou. The pope tried to impact control over southern Italy and Venice by placing Charles at the head of a crusade. Charles, however, had limited resources, and even after being proclaimed King of Sicily, made things worse by effectively antagonizing his own subjects, who instead offered their allegiance to the King of Aragon. The papacy made Aragon the target of yet another crusade, resulting in a disastrous war amongst Christian princes and their armies fighting on European soil.
Of course, we are now on the road to the Avignon papacy. Now, the French king, Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, who reigned between 1286 and 1314, resolved to punish the papacy for abusing powers. In 1300, Pope Boniface VIII, who reigned between 1294 and 1303, celebrated a papal jubilee, the apex of papal power. Philip challenged the power of the papacy. In 1303, he sent an army to Rome to threaten the Pope. Boniface was mistreated and died. In 1309, Philip then forced the new Pope, Clement V, from Rome to Avignon, located in southern France.
So, the power of the papacy reached a new height in the 13th century, but as popes attempted to extend the influence into the secular sphere, political struggles ensued. while centralization and promotion of education and ministry work were probably the biggest boons to the French captivity of the papacy. It also led to increased surveillance, corruption, and calls for reform, which would ultimately culminate in the Great Schism.
And the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Now, the papacy remained in Avignon until 1378, which was known as the Babylonian captivity. The church and papacy were controlled by France. Now, we'll notice that it was removed from the Italian politics and was certainly distant from the German emperors. Next, we have 7 popes who reside in Avignon. 111 of the 134 cardinals that were appointed were French. Also, there was the loss of the spiritual authority, tales of luxury and corruption.
The papacy would never abandon its claims to overlordship in Rome and the Papal States. It needed money, though, and the Avignon popes would impose new taxes and obligations. Avignon popes also claimed the right to appoint bishops and priests to vacant areas anywhere in Christendom, which is a break with tradition. The Avignon popes strengthened administrative control over the church, but weakened the papacy's moral authority, largely due to simony and sexual misbehavior. Stop me if you've heard that one before. But here we have the papal palace at Avignon. The work on this great fortified palace was begun in 1339. It symbolizes the apparent permanence of the papal residence in Avignon, though to me it looks a bit like a prison. Why was it constructed as a fortress as well as a palace? Either way, it's a Foucauldian institution.
Medieval faith came to revolve around sacraments. Baptism, administered to infants to safeguard their souls in case of an early death. We have the confession of sins to a priest, thought to guarantee God's forgiveness. We have the extreme unction, the final absolution of all sins. We have marriage, required only the exchange of promises. We have pilgrimages and crusading were extreme forms of penance. The Eucharist was the central sacrament. Most received once a year at Easter. The viewing of the consecration considered sharing in sacrament, and many attended daily Mass to view consecration.
Medieval Christians experienced the church largely at the local level. One of Pope Innocent III's legacies was that nearly all of Europe was covered by a network of parish churches by the end of the 13th century. Parish priests taught the elements of Christian doctrine, administered the sacraments, rituals, of course, that convey the grace of God to individual Christians. Here we have a depiction of "This is my body," the elevation of the host, in other words. It's a fresco from the chapel of Assisi and was painted by Simone Martini in the 1320s. It shows the moment in the Mass when the priest raises the Eucharistic host so that it can be seen by the faithful. The Latin phrase spoken at this moment, "Hoc est einum corpus meum," this is indeed my body, was regarded as transforming the substance of the bread into the divine essence of Christ's body. Since medieval Christians believed that the sight of the host was just as powerful as ingesting it, would they have responded to this life size image of the elevation? What does the appearance of the angels above the altar signify?
Now, let us look at the pursuit of holiness, which we could consider to be embodied in the German Dominican friar Master Eckhart, roughly between 1260 and 1327. Now, he taught that there is a spark deep within every human soul and that God lives in this spark. And through prayer and self renunciation, any person could retreat into this inner recess of his or her being and access divinity. He conveyed the message that lay people could attain salvation through their own efforts without a priest or sacraments. As a result, many of Eckhart's teachings were condemned, but such views found support in the teachings of popular preachers after the Black Death.
The theme of preachers in this area is that salvation lay open to any Christian that strove for it. It helps to explain the central place of the Mass and the other sacraments in daily life. It also explains why many sought new paths to lead to God. Wait until we get to Martin Luther. Many, though, would seek a mystical union with God through rigorous prayer, penance, and personal sacrifice. These, of course, are condemned as heresy, and thus it is with heresy that we end today's session. Next time, on to the problem of sovereignty.